Welcome to Ask Me Anything. Thank you for joining for another session of Ask Me Anything. Today, we'll pick back up about Christian parenting. Last time we took a break and P. Johnny did a session on why should we pray. Before that, part one of parenting was calling. Part two was grace. And then today, part three, we'll look at law. How can I become a better Christian parent? So let's begin with the principle that Paul David Tripp gives for this chapter. He says, your children need God's law, but you cannot ask the law to do what only grace can accomplish. So let me start with a question. What tool are you relying on to effect change in your children? So take a few moments to ponder on that question. Most parents rely on the tool of law to effect change in their children. By law, I mean they establish certain rules for their children, and they discipline their children if they break those laws or rules. Don't get me wrong, the law is important in raising your children, but it does not have the power to change your child. Could it be that you're asking the law to do what only grace of God can do in your children? Tripp says, if rules and regulations had the power to change the heart and life of your child, rescuing your child from himself and giving him a heart of submission and faith, Jesus would have never needed to come. So I want to consider 5 points on the law in parenting. Number 1, your children needs God's law. Law is important for every human being because it teaches us what is good or bad, what is right or wrong. So without the law, we would be lost and be in the dark about how we are to live, to speak, to act, to desire. That God has given us laws, it is in itself grace. The law is meant to protect our children and guide them in the best direction. So number 1, law is needed because it's a guide for us. Number 2, our children need God's law because it convicts them that there are sinners. The law exposes not only their sinful behavior, but more importantly, their sinful hearts. And so it's crucial for our children to be convicted of their sin and their weaknesses, because only then will they honor and obey their parents and God. Number 2, your children need to understand the law's weakness. We need to understand that the law is good, but it does not have the power to effect change in our children. Law is good, like I said, that it directs our children in the right path and reveals them as sinners, but it can never deliver our children from the power of sin's grip, create a new heart in them, and effect a lasting change in our child. So we need to understand the limitation of the law, although it's good. Therefore, Tripp says this about most Christian parents. Is this you? He says, they have reduced Christian parenting down to being really faithful lawgiver, arresting officer, prosecutor, judge, and jailer. So their parenting is basically a body of rules followed by threats of punishment. Number 3, you need to understand that God's grace is essential to parenting. If the law does not have the power to effect change in our children, then what does have the power? The answer is God's grace. Tripp says, as a parent, you are not called to just enforce God's law in the lives of your children, but also to consistently exhibit and teach God's grace to them as well. As parents, we need to always have two tools as we parent our children. They are law and grace. You will fail parenting if only you use one or the other tool and not both. You need both the law and the grace, just as God our Father parents us with both tools. In terms of grace, as parents, we need to exhibit and teach God's grace. And so our next 2 points, point 4 and point 5, will explain what it means to exhibit and teach God's grace to our children. Number 4, you need to preach the gospel to your children. We need to take every opportunity we have with our children to talk to them about their need for God's grace and how Jesus meets our needs. Tripp says you should look every day for every opportunity to point your needy kids to the presence, promises, power, and grace of Jesus. It's because only God's grace that can change the hearts of our children, which will then result in the change of their behavior and actions. Number 5, you need to model the gospel of grace to your children. Your children will follow not what you say, but what you do. Therefore, it's crucial as parents that we model the gospel of grace to our children. Not only do we talk, but more importantly, we need to model, incarnate grace to our children. We are God's ambassador to our children, and thus our message of grace must be aligned with our actions of grace when we deal with our children. So do you display God's patience and forgiving grace to your children? So there you have it, the 5 points on law in parenting. Which of the 5 do you need to work on the most? Please share on the comments below. So let me remind you, number 1, your children need God's law. Number 2, your children need to understand the law's weakness. Number 3, you need to understand that God's grace is essential. Number 4, you need to preach the gospel to your children. And number 5, you need to model the gospel of grace to your children. So this completes our 3-part series on parenting based on David Tripp's Parenting 14 Gospel Principles that can radically change your family. If you like the content so far, which I think it's wonderful, I strongly recommend that you purchase Tripp's book and continue to read and discover 11 more great principles in parenting. May God bless you as you continue to glorify God through parenting.